Sometimes you hear people talking about like activist judges,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not quite sure what they mean. Well, we're going to dive into that today. Specifically, from a conservative viewpoint, we've got a really fascinating collection of like articles, legal analyses, and even some background on a group you might have heard of, the Federalist Society.
I think what's really intriguing about this topic is that it isn't just like disagreeing with a particular judge or even a particular ruling, but it's about a whole way of thinking about the role of the courts in our government.
Okay, so it's like a fundamental difference in philosophy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about it this way. Imagine you're baking a cake, right? You wouldn't just throw in whatever ingredients you feel like in the moment. You would follow the recipe pretty closely,
Yeah.
especially if it's a recipe that's been tried and true for generations,
I see where you're going with this. So for conservatives who are concerned about judicial activism, the recipe is the Constitution.
Precisely. And they believe that judges should stick as closely as possible to the original meaning of that recipe, the way it was understood when it was first written.
That makes sense. So is that where terms like originalism and textualism come in?
Absolutely. Originalism means interpreting the Constitution based on what the words meant back then, not on our modern day ideas or anything like that. And textualism focuses very specifically on the actual words of the law without reading too much into like the intent or the broader social context and things like that.
So it's all about being strict about following the original recipe, so to speak.
You got it. And this ties directly into their concerns about judicial overreach. They worry that judges are sometimes stepping outside the bounds of their role, essentially adding ingredients to the cake that weren't in the original recipe.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here, but can you give me like a real-world example of what conservatives might see as judicial overreach?
Sure. One example that comes up a lot in our sources is the use of nationwide injunctions. These are court orders that block a federal law or policy from taking effect across the entire country, even if the case was only brought by a small group of people in one state.
Wow. So one judge can essentially put a pause on something the president or Congress has decided.
That's right. And conservatives often argue that this gives too much power to individual judges and undermines the authority of the other branches of government, particularly the executive branch.
Speaking of the executive branch, these sources also talk a lot about conservatives wanting a robust executive branch. What exactly does that mean, and how does it fit into this whole philosophy?
That's a great question. It's about wanting the president to have more freedom to act, especially in areas like national security and administrative matters. They believe that the president, as the one person elected by the whole country, should have a significant leeway to implement their agenda.
So they're okay with nationwide injunctions when they stop a president they disagree with?
Not necessarily. The argument is more about the principle of the thing. They believe that, in general, judges should be very cautious about blocking actions by the president or Congress, because those are the branches that are directly accountable to the voters.
So it goes back to that idea of who has the authority to make decisions and who the voters have chosen to represent them.
Exactly. And this leads us to another key aspect of conservative legal thought: the emphasis on the role of elected officials as the primary policymakers.
Because they're the ones who have to answer to the people.
Right. Conservatives argue that elected officials, not unelected judges, should be the ones making the big decisions that shape our society. They worry that appointed judges might be less accountable to the will of the people.
Now, I know we can't talk about conservative legal thought without mentioning a group that's been in the news a lot.
Yeah.
The Federalist Society.
Yeah.
They seem to have a big influence on this whole conversation.
They absolutely do. The Federalist Society has become a major force in shaping the conservative legal landscape.
Can you give us a little background on them? Where did they come from, and what are they all about?
Sure. The Federalist Society was founded back in 1982 by law students, interestingly enough, at some of the most elite law schools in the country: Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. It's grown a lot since then and now has over 70,000 members, mostly lawyers, and they have chapters all over the country, over 90 cities in the U.S., and even hold a big annual convention in Washington, D.C.
So they've definitely got a wide reach.
Mm-hmm.
But what exactly is their focus when it comes to the law?
Well, they're deeply committed to those principles we were just talking about: originalism, textualism, and a limited role for the judiciary. They believe judges should stick closely to the text of the Constitution and avoid imposing their own personal views or trying to make social change through their rulings.
So how does that play out in practice? Can you give us an example of a specific case where the Federalist Society's influence was really clear.
Absolutely. Let's take the case of parents involved in community schools v. Seattle School District Number 1. This case dealt with using race as a factor in school admissions, and the Federalist Society took a very strong stance on it.
What was their argument?
They argued that any consideration of race in school admissions, even if it's meant to promote diversity, is ultimately discriminatory and goes against the principle of equal treatment under the law. They believe that the Constitution is colorblind, and that any attempt to use race as a factor, whether for inclusion or exclusion, is wrong.
Interesting. So even if the goal is to create a more diverse student body, they would say that's not the role of the courts to decide.
Exactly. They would argue that those decisions should be made by elected officials, school boards, or other bodies that are directly accountable to the people, not by judges.
Okay, so that gives us a good sense of how the Federalist Society's philosophy can play out in a very real-world situation. But I know they've also been involved in a lot of other high-profile cases.
No, definitely. Their influence is pretty far-reaching.
And we'll dive into those next. So we've been talking about the Federalist Society's philosophy, but how have they actually managed to have such a big impact on the legal system? Is it just about having a lot of members?
Well, it's definitely more than just numbers. They've been incredibly strategic about it. They focus on influencing legal thought over the long term, and they do that through a few key avenues. So one is scholarship. They publish a lot of articles and books that promote their views. They're also involved in strategic litigation, so they carefully choose cases that have the potential to shift legal interpretations in their favor. And then they're also really good at networking, so they connect conservative lawyers, judges, academics, and kind of create this powerful network of influence.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach,
Yeah.
working from different angles to shape the legal landscape.
Exactly. And one of the most significant examples of their impact is in the area of gun rights. They played a key role in shifting the legal interpretation of the Second Amendment.
That's a big deal. How did they manage to do that?
Well, for a long time, the prevailing view of the Second Amendment was that it protected the right to bear arms in the context of a militia, like the National Guard. The Federalist Society really pushed back against that, arguing that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual's right to own guns for self-defense, regardless of militia service.
And that argument ended up winning out in the courts.
Yes. Most notably in the District of Columbia v. Heller case in 2008. That case struck down a very strict handgun ban in Washington, D.C., and it was a major victory for gun rights advocates. And the Federalist Society was right there in the thick of it, providing legal arguments and support to the lawyers challenging the ban.
So they were instrumental in changing how we view gun rights in America.
They definitely played a significant role. And Heller wasn't the only case where they had a big impact. Our sources mention a few other landmark cases, like Citizens United v. FEC, which loosened restrictions on campaign spending by corporations and unions, and National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius, which challenged the Affordable Care Act.
Wow, so their reach really extends across a lot of different areas of law.
It does, and their influence has been especially noticeable during certain presidential administrations.
Like which ones?
Well, but George W. Bush appointed a lot of judges who were members of the Federalist Society, almost half of his appellate court nominees.
And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. He was very open about relying on the Federalist Society for his Supreme Court picks.
Very true. Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all three of his Supreme Court nominees have ties to the Federalist Society.
That's a pretty big deal. So essentially, a group founded by a handful of law students has now played a role in shaping the highest court in the land.
It's a pretty remarkable story, and it speaks to the power of ideas in strategic planning.
But I also remember that Trump's relationship with the Federalist Society wasn't always smooth sailing, especially after the 2020 election. What happened there?
Right. That's where things get a little complicated. You see, after the election, some members of the Federalist Society were very vocal in their support for Trump's claims of election fraud. They even filed lawsuits and made public statements challenging the election results.
I'm guessing that didn't sit well with everyone in the organization.
It definitely created some internal tension. There were other members who felt that those actions were undermining the rule of law and damaging the Federalist Society's reputation. They argued that regardless of who wins an election, it's important to respect the democratic process and accept the results.
So even within a group that's generally seen as being very unified, there can be disagreements about how to apply their principles in the real world.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even within a shared ideology, there can be a spectrum of views and different approaches to legal and political issues.
Well, it certainly makes you think about the individuals behind the movement and how those individual choices can shape the direction of a whole organization.
It does. And speaking of individuals, we should probably mention some of the most prominent figures associated with the Federalist Society.
Yes. Who are some of the big names?
Well, the late Justice Antonin Scalia was a founding member and a leading light of the movement. He was a strong advocate for originalism and textualism, and his opinions had a huge impact on American jurisprudence. Chief Justice John Roberts' membership in the Federalist Society is disputed, but he's often linked to the group, and his decisions often align with their thinking. And then you have figures like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, both senators with strong ties to the Federalist Society.
So it's not just judges and lawyers, it's also politicians and policymakers.
Right. And that shows how the Federalist Society's influence extends beyond the courtroom and into the halls of power.
Okay, so we've gone pretty deep on the Federalist Society, but I'm wondering, where does all of this leave us in terms of the big picture? What does the future hold for conservative legal thought?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's a lot of debate about whether the Federalist Society's influence has peaked or whether they're just getting started.
What are some of the factors that might shape their future impact?
Well, one thing to consider is the changing composition of the courts. With so many Federalist Society-aligned judges now sitting on federal benches, their ideas are likely to continue to have an impact for decades to come.
That's true. And it's not just about the judges themselves, right? It's also about the lawyers who are coming up through the ranks, many of whom have been influenced by the Federalist Society's ideas.
Exactly. They've been very successful at cultivating a new generation of conservative legal minds. But there's also a counter-movement brewing.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, there are a growing number of law professors, students, and activists who are pushing back against the Federalist Society's dominance. They're arguing for a more progressive vision of the law, one that takes into account social justice, economic inequality, and the need for systemic change.
So it's like a battle of ideas playing out in the legal arena.
It is, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this all unfolds in the coming years.
It definitely makes you realize that the law isn't just some static set of rules. It's a constantly evolving field that's shaped by these kinds of debates and ideological struggles.
Exactly. And understanding those struggles is essential if you want to make sense of the legal and political landscape around us.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've unpacked the concept of judicial activism, explored the rise and influence of the Federalist Society, and even peeked into the future of conservative legal thought.
It's been a real deep dive.
It has. And I think it's important to emphasize that we've been focusing on conservative perspectives on judicial authority. There are, of course, other viewpoints out there. And it's crucial to engage with those perspectives as well.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the different ways people interpret the law and its role in our society.
Well, before we wrap up, I'm curious about something. You mentioned earlier that some liberal scholars are starting to embrace originalism and textualism. I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Is it possible that these ideas, which were once seen as purely conservative, could become more mainstream?
It's a trend that I think has been fascinating to watch. You see, for a long time, these approaches to interpreting the Constitution were seen as almost exclusively the domain of conservative legal thinkers. But increasingly, you have legal scholars on the left who are finding value in these methods of interpretation.
Yeah, that makes me think of that analogy you used earlier about the cake recipe. Is it possible that even folks who might want to add some new ingredients to the cake, so to speak, still appreciate the importance of having a clear and consistent recipe to follow?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. There's a recognition that even if you disagree with the outcome that a strict interpretation of the Constitution might lead to, there's still value in having a predictable and consistent framework for legal decision-making.
So it's not necessarily about everyone agreeing on every single ingredient, but rather about agreeing on the process for deciding what goes in the cake.
Precisely. And I think that's where this conversation gets really interesting, because as these ideas gain wider acceptance, it could lead to some unexpected shifts in the legal landscape.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what those shifts might look like. Could we see new interpretations of long-standing legal precedents? Or maybe even new alliances forming on certain issues.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Think about it this way. If more liberal scholars start to embrace originalism, it could open up new avenues for challenging laws and policies that have long been seen as settled. It could also lead to more common ground between liberals and conservatives on certain issues, where a strict interpretation of the Constitution might actually lead to outcomes that both sides support.
So it's like the playing field is being leveled in a way,
Yeah.
with everyone using the same set of tools, even if they have different goals in mind.
That's a great way to think about it. And it makes predicting the future of legal thought even more complex and intriguing.
Well, I have to say I've learned a lot from this deep dive. It's really made me think about the complexities of judicial authority and how different perspectives shape our understanding of the law.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think it's a reminder that these debates are never truly settled. They're ongoing conversations that will continue to shape our legal and political landscape for generations to come.
I'm sure our listener feels the same way. So before we sign off, is there anything else you want to leave our listener with? Any final thoughts or questions to ponder?
I would say this. As you continue to explore these ideas, pay attention to the nuances. Don't just focus on the headlines or the sound bites. Dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge your own assumptions. Because the more you understand about different perspectives on the law, the better equipped you'll be to engage in thoughtful and informed discussions about the issues that matter most.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this fascinating material.
It's been my pleasure. These conversations are always so enriching.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Remember, there's always more to learn, so keep exploring and keep those questions coming.
Happy learning.
That's it for today's deep dive. Until next time.